to really give a special thank you to our local host committee, specifically to our host location, Lisa Riviera. Could you please stand? We want to personally say thank you. She is a member here at Bassbury Sam's and has graciously offered us this beautiful space. So the ABA Criminal Justice Section, we want to say thank you. And also, we're really grateful for local criminal justice practitioners who have welcomed us to Nashville, but also been a part of the planning committee over the last 6 months. And Joy Boyd Longnecker is one of those members of the planning committee, and Scarlett Nokes. So we just want to personally say thank you all. Session that you're going to hear today is actually organized by Joy and Scarlett, and I am going to introduce Joy Boyd Longnecker, who is at Baker Donelson, and she will introduce the panel and give the bios, but you also have bios and programs on your table. So Joy, without further ado.
Thank you. I am really so excited and honored to be sitting at the same table with all of these women. I think you're going to be really impressed by their stories, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time reading through the bios, but I do want to highlight some key things about each of the panelists that make them special and unique. First, we have Scarlett Nokes. Scarlett probably would never tell you this, but she's a graduate of Harvard Law School, and she clerked for Judge Gibbons on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. Then she spent and did a circuit through almost every southeastern U.S. Attorney's office. She has worked in Birmingham and Nashville and Savannah. During her time as a federal prosecutor, she prosecuted more than 200 cases, many of which were white-collar cases, including fraud and money laundering, identity theft, and RICO conspiracy. She has represented the United States in a number of trials, over 20 trials, including the corruption trials of the sitting Birmingham mayor and a former Jefferson County commissioner, which if you're from Alabama is pretty significant, and it was big news at the time. Scarlett now practices at the Bradley Law Firm here in Nashville. To Scarlett's left, we have Jimmie Lynn Ramsaur. She is the chief of the criminal division. She's been in that position since January 2009. She's with the local U.S. Attorney's Office here in Nashville. She was first sworn in as an AUSA in September of 1987. Since that time, she has handled hundreds of civil and criminal cases for the office, including asset forfeiture, bankruptcy, and FLU. She currently serves as the U.S. Attorney's Office Giglio Requesting Officer and has previously served as the office's professional responsibility officer. She is a graduate of the University of Tennessee College of Law. Interestingly, started her career with the Public Defender's Office and Legal Aid, and then joined a small all-female law firm in Nashville when that was certainly an oddity, and they may have been the only one at the time. I'll let Jimmie tell you more about that here in a moment. To Jimmie's left, we have Mariah Wooten. Mariah is the first assistant federal defender here in Nashville, Tennessee. She has dedicated her professional life to the practice of criminal law. She has served as an assistant federal defender since 1985, and she rose to the position and has held on to it since 1990. She has been an adjunct and teaches trial advocacy at Vanderbilt University College of Law, and has also been an instructor at NIDA, the National Institute of Trial Advocacy, Harvard, Duke University, and the University of North Carolina. And last but not least, we have the Yankee on our panel, Tina Luongo. She's the Chief Defender for the Legal Aid Society of New York. She's currently the attorney in charge for the criminal defense practice, and where she's served in that capacity since 2014. She leads a citywide team of 12 managers who in turn manage the practices over 1,100 staff members. So she's very, very busy, and we're glad that she made time for us here today. She began her legal aid career in September 2002 as a staff attorney in the New York County Trial Office, and was promoted to supervising attorney in 2007. So our first question, and what I want this group to hear first, and we'll kind of go down the line, we'll start with you, Scarlett, is, our topic and our breakout session is about the glass ceiling, and I want to know from each of you, how did you get here? How did you get to where you are?
Certainly, I love hearing people's stories, and I think mine may not be the most interesting, but probably the single most important thing about my background that led me down the path that I am on professionally is that my father is in law enforcement. He was a local police officer. I grew up in Florence, Alabama. He was police chief there for almost 20 years and still is the county sheriff in the county I grew up in. So I was fascinated by his work as a young child, and he taught criminal justice at the local community college when I was a preteen and teenager. And I would actually go to class with him just to soak it up. So all of that led me to believe that I wanted to be an FBI agent. I was a psychology major in college at Birmingham Southern, small little Methodist liberal arts school in Birmingham. Really thought that that's what I wanted to do. Was fortunate to intern at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, my junior year of college in the behavioral science unit. Watched Silence of the Lambs too many times. But in talking to agents there, they really encouraged me to go to law school. That the Bureau really was interested in recruiting both women and attorneys, and that if I had the JD, I would be a shoo-in to get hired as an agent. So I had 3 semesters of college left, and that was the first time I had given law school any thought at all. Was fortunate to have great professors and pre-law advisors, all men, who directed me to how to prepare, went through multiple revisions of a personal statement. And oddly, my personal statement for law school revolved around a murder case in my hometown. It happened at a restaurant right on the Tennessee River, about 2 miles from the house I grew up in, a little waterfront restaurant where 2 brothers went in one night and stabbed the owner to death, stabbed him over 27 times. I had done an unpaid internship in the DA's office following my FBI internship and was in the room the first time the evidence was opened to prepare for trial. But what made such an impact on me is that I knew the owner, the victim. I also knew the defendants. I had gone to elementary school with both of them. They had been at my birthday parties as a child. And so it was just dramatically personal, and I can't imagine law schools get too many personal statements written about pending murder trials. But I guess my point in all this is that I've been on the criminal justice path since the beginning. And then when I got to law school, September 11th happened 2 weeks later. The FBI, of course, drastically altered their mission to focus on anti-terrorism, and I decided that being a federal prosecutor would be a much better job. I wouldn't have to move around. Of course, fast forward to today, I'm married to a federal agent, which has precipitated my tour of the Southeast because he, in fact, does have to move around occasionally. But yeah, I've been very fortunate. I loved every day that I worked as an AUSA, and I'm thoroughly enjoying private practice at this point in my career, but can't imagine being in any area other than criminal justice.
Unlike Scarlett, I had no intention of practicing criminal law. It was probably one of my worst grades in law school. I did get interested in sort of a trial practice, and really spent every hour and moment I could my 3rd year of law school down in the clinic at UT. We had an excellent clinical program at UT. And it was down in the basement of the law school, essentially. And I spent every moment I could down there, learning everything I could. And I had some really great people that I met there and worked with, some professors and people who were there sort of on a temporary basis, one of whom was Walter Kurtz. And Jim Weatherly, both of whom came back to Nashville to practice criminal law. I left law school and went to legal services. I felt honored to have gotten a position in Nashville it's called legal services back then, the legal aid office, because it was a really growing, it was a very impressive program in the Southeast, the one here in Nashville was, and so I felt really honored to have a position there. And I worked there for 4 years, a little over, about 4.5 years. until Walter, I had a baby and was on maternity leave. Walter called me. He had, a lot of us, a lot of the young, energetic, left-wing, new lawyers in Nashville had gotten together and helped elect Walter Kurtz, the first really full-time, good public defender that Nashville and Davidson County had. And he took office in August of 81, I think, 80.
78.
78, okay. He called me up after I'd had my baby and said, why don't you come to work over here? And at first I thought that was the craziest thing I'd ever heard of. And he said basically that, he said, I promise you that unlike legal services, you won't have a bunch of committee meetings. We won't have everybody in to decide every little issue, and we won't discuss everything for hours. I'll make all the decisions, and you can just go in there and practice law. I said, that sounds like an excellent idea. And I said, okay, well, I'll come give it a try, we'll see. And I went to work over there, and the first year, I spent every other week in General Sessions Court on what's called the jail docket. And basically, I went down there before the sun came up, and I left after the sun came down. And, would eat bologna sandwiches as the inmates were eating, and was representing people who were not able to make bond on the first initial appearances they had. And then the next week, I would get to see the sun if it wasn't raining, because I would be handling all the bond dockets for the Public Defender's Office. And I shared that duty with, those of you who are from Nashville, I shared that duty with Bill Purcell. I started 2 weeks after I did. So we swapped back and forth, and we did this for a year. And from there, I graduated and was able to move up to criminal court. I tried my first jury trial, and I thought it was like being infected with a virus, or it was like trying, I guess, crack cocaine. I never had it, but there was no turning back. For me, there was no higher high, and there's never been a lower low than practicing and trying a case in front of a jury. I just thought this is the greatest thing ever. Now, as a defense lawyer, it can certainly be disappointing because your client's life and liberty is on the line, but still, as a lawyer, it is the most thrilling thing that I have ever and will ever do in my life, I think. And that's what I wanted to do from then on. I stayed there only 2 years because that was hard work. I don't know how folks stay at the Public Defender's Office a long, long time. There are people who do it and do it well, exceptionally well. There are people in the Federal Public Defender's Office who do it well. There are people in the State Public Defender's Office who do it exceptionally well for a long time. But I'm telling you what, I felt like it was killing me because it was hard work for sure. But it was great. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I left there, and as Joy said, I went into practice with 2 other women who had been in practice for about a year, and we were Nashville's only, at that point, only all-female law firm. Had a great time. We even made a little bit of money. It was not, we weren't making millions of dollars, but we were making pretty good money. My problem was that most of my practice, and this was in 1982, 3, and 4, most of my practice at that point, I took appointed cases, but most of it was the retained work was DUIs and simple possession cases. I was not getting the kind of criminal defense work I had been doing at the Public Defender's Office. So needless to say, it was not very exciting. It was pretty boring. It was pretty mundane. I then got on the panel at the federal court, federal defenders panel, and was able to take some appointed cases there, and that was exciting and much more interesting for me. And after I had done that for a few years, I got an offer from the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I thought, well, why shouldn't I try that out for a while? I should see how you do it on the other side. It'll probably make me a better defense lawyer if I try that out. And I took the offer, went to work there, and it was 1987, and I've never looked back. I've stayed here. I've done everything that you can do in the U.S. Attorney's Office except Social Security cases and medical malpractice cases. At one point or another, I've done asset forfeiture cases. I've really done everything. I've concentrated mostly on white collar, but I've done RICO gang cases. I've done tax fraud, healthcare fraud cases. Another AUSA, and I tried one of the first major healthcare fraud cases that got tried in the country back in 1992. I've just done a variety of cases, and I've enjoyed it. Over the years, I've had just incredible opportunities, worked with some great people. Generally speaking, we have a very good, we have an excellent public defender's office, and generally speaking, we have a very good federal defense bar in Nashville. And so it's been a pleasure to work with them and to work across from them too. And so I'm still there and still enjoying it, at least for the time being. It's the best job you can have.
Well, I'll be briefer. My career is not that interesting to others. I like Jimmie, Lynn, went to the University of Tennessee College of Law, and while in school there, I was involved in the clinic and was able to try a case with a lawyer. And she even let me ask some questions. And I was so, I probably asked 5 questions, and I worked on it for about 3 days. But, and so I was really interested in trial practice. Initially, I had intended, in fact, I had accepted a job with legal services in Florida. But got a call from this guy, Walter Kurtz, who said, hey, I'm starting this new thing with public defenders in Nashville. Would you come join the team? I wanted to come back to Nashville because my mother was here, well, not far away, and I wanted to be near her. So Walter says, if you read these 50 cases before we have our first meeting, you'll be on the team. And I was. Like Jimmie Lynn said, he was sworn in, actually it was September 1st, 1978. And so I was hired in as an investigator because at the time, and maybe now, you had to be a licensed attorney to represent someone because they're entitled to effective assistance of counsel, and you couldn't represent someone without, I don't even know if they had the Supreme Court rule back then that allowed you to practice with someone else. So I started in September as an investigator, and for a full month I was an investigator until the bar results came out, and then I became a lawyer. And he said, I'll let you try the case, I'll run the office. Well, dictators do that. But at any rate, he was real, he wasn't a dictator, but he was real adamant about us providing effective assistance of counsel. And he pushed us and pushed us and pushed us. And like Jimmie Lynn, when I had my very first trial, I won. I was probably shaken. I think they felt sorry for me and didn't care about my defendant. I felt like I was shaken inside as I asked questions and gave closing arguments or whatever. But it really, I guess the bug bit me too. I loved it and tried many cases after that. I like the interaction with people. I can't say I liked every client I have had, but I've not disliked every client I've had. Whether I like them or not is unimportant. I might say you're not a nice person, but I'll still represent you so long as a certain number of things exist. I've been practicing criminal defense law for many, many years. At some point I went to the Federal Public Defender's Office. I think it was in '84, but when you get to my age, you don't even worry about it. And I love that. I really, really did like that a lot. The law has changed tremendously over the years. I can remember when there were no mandatory minimums. I can remember when there were no guidelines. I can remember when there were a lot of things. And it's become more restrictive in many ways in the recent years, and more liberating also. It's somewhat gone back to some of the things that existed when I first started practicing federal criminal law, which did not have the restrictions. Judges that the guidelines brought about. Judges were able to exercise their own discretion as to what sentence to impose, for example, in a case. And Congress and subsequently the Sentencing Commission kind of restricted that, and those who have practiced any federal law may know that there was a period of time, too long for me, where the judge just primarily had to impose a sentence within the guidelines. I guess it was about in 2005 that the Supreme Court came out with 2 cases, Booker and Fan, which says we're going to give you some of the discretion back. And it opened up federal practice again. I've tried a lot of cases representing people charged with almost everything but the death penalty. I like what I do. Plan to do it a little bit longer.
I didn't initially go to law school after undergrad. I worked. So I spent 10 years doing gang prevention intervention work through New York City's education system and through community-based organizations and through Boys and Girls Clubs of America, and did that for 10 years in a program called Counsel for Unity, who actually I was in when I was in high school, and it sort of turned my life around. And so I was giving back for about 10 years, and I started doing community-based work, but over the 10 years had gone on to become part of administration and running the fundraising development financial department. So it sort of, in my career, moved away from the work that I actually love to do, which was to work with people, young people in particular, and decided, I was hitting 30, decided time to figure out a next career path, more importantly, a next educational path for myself, and went to law school at night for 4 years at Brooklyn Law School, and thought until year 3 I was going to continue to do the work I was doing, just with a law degree. And then I took trial advocacy, and that's all she wrote. And got the bug. I knew that this was what I wanted to do, but here's the problem, right? I really wanted to work with the communities that I was already serving. And lucky for me, that the professor was Jane Booth, who was a former legal aid alum, who is now the head of the Southern District Civil Rights Division. And she said, you've got a gift and you've got to go give back, so go to legal aid. And I had 1 year to now turn it around, right? I was taking labor law classes, I was taking nonprofit, and I, luckily for that 4th year, because I was really dreading that 4th year as I was watching everybody else graduate, and now I had this chance. And so I connected to another woman who was at Legal Aid, a professor, Eve Carey. Sorry, she was not at Legal Aid, she was an alum, Eve Carey, in the law school, and I took her prisoners' rights class, and through that interned with the Prisoners' Rights Project at Legal Aid. And then was very, very fortunate that the year I started, Giuliani was out, our mayor who had cut Legal Aid Society and eviscerated our budget because our union struck for pay, and he hated us. But Bloomberg was coming in, our new mayor, and he was fiscally conservative, and he thought, oh, let's give the money to the public defenders instead. It's cheaper. We changed that around over the last couple of years, but that was my entree. And so I became a staff attorney, a public defender in our Manhattan trial office, and I did what I was doing. But I wanted to teach, and I became a supervisor in that same office about 5 years after. So I was teaching and trying classes. And then I got a call from another woman, Janet Sable, who at the time was our general counsel, but right now is our acting interim chief and CEO. And she said, I've got a project that I think you'd really be interested in. The ABA is launching a task force on comprehensive holistic defense. And they would have asked Legal Aid Society, somebody from Legal Aid Society to chair it. Would you do it? And I thought, what do I know? What? I'm trying cases, I'm teaching, what? And I did. And I met this organization, and it actually put me in the path to how I became a chief, because through that work, I started to grow my vision about what our office at Legal Aid should be doing, what public defense our organization should be doing, what is a best practice for the people we serve, the clients we serve. And through that, lo and behold, I became the deputy and then eventually the chief. Again, moving a little bit away from the communities and where I started, but here's my sort of view of leadership in public defender offices. Yes, I don't actually stand in a courtroom and push against the laws being imposed and oppressing my clients standing to my side. but my clients are every single New Yorker accused. Or if you think about it as a community of defenders, and I was just in Kentucky at a convening of public defenders, it is the collective work we do to push against the systems that have been racist and oppressive for decades and centuries. And it's sort of that role that continues to guide me. And the sort of frame by which I think, as we talk about who's coming into the work, particularly women, and particularly women of color coming out of our law schools, it's that type of work that people want to do. So it's not only the litigation, but it's that system reform and the civil rights fight that needs to happen. So I love what I do every day.
Thank you, Tina. I think to talk about where we are, it would be helpful to have a sense of how far we've come. And so while we still have some work to do, I will ask Jimmie, Lynn, and then Mariah, talk about what the criminal law bar in Nashville looked like when you first started practicing criminal law. Jimmie, Lynn?
We talked about this on a phone call, getting ready for this. In terms of the bench, there was one female judge. Sissy Daughtry was appointed by our Governor Blanton to the Court of Criminal Appeals in 1976. So before Mariah and I started practicing, I started in 77, Mariah started in 78. She was, I believe, the only female judge, at least in the Middle Tennessee area. I'm not aware of, I don't know about Memphis, or I don't think there were any in Knoxville either. There was nobody on the local bench, on the trial bench at that point, civil or criminal. Mariah, at the public defender's office, Mariah was there before I was, but by the time I got there, Mariah had already come and gone. There was Joan Hamner, who was doing juvenile criminal work. There was Andre Lee at the public defender's office. Another woman, Pat Newton, may have been there, or she had left by that time.
She had left by the time you got there.
And Sue Ellen Weidman was there. And then I was there. So there were a small handful of us in the public defender's office. In terms of the private bar, I don't really recall anybody in private practice, any females in private practice, and there were no females on the bench. I think the first female on the bench would be Barbara Haynes, who would have been on the bench. She was elected in 1982, so that was the first female we had, and she would have had a criminal general sessions docket every so often. They rotated around. So it was, there were not many women around. It was an extremely male atmosphere. And really that was true civil or criminal, frankly. When I first came to Nashville in 1977, and I apologize, I've told this story a lot, but the female lawyers in town could pretty much get around one large round table and have a meeting among ourselves. I mean, we all knew each other. We knew our spouses, we knew our significant others, we were all friends. I mean, you couldn't miss us, we stuck out like sore thumbs, basically. There were a few people who were not in trial practice. I think, I'm not positive, but I think the first female here in Bassbury may have been Julie Jones. Am I right about that, Lisa, or was it somebody else?
I'm not sure, was she ahead of Lee Wall?
Yeah. So I mean, there weren't many female lawyers in Nashville. It was, there were few at legal services when I went there. When I went to legal services, there was Dot Dobbins and Margaret Bim, and everybody else was male. It's just, that's the way it was, I left law school with 25% female in my class, so I felt pretty fortunate there, but there just were not that many female lawyers in Nashville. Did it affect how I did things? Well, I mean, I spoke earlier about how, I was concerned about how I should be dressed. I think everybody was, whether we should wear this, pants or not pants, whether we should, do we wear suits. I think we were very self-conscious of how we presented ourselves. Were we treated differently? Well, of course we were treated differently. We expected to be treated differently. You know, we didn't think it was right, but that's the way it was. And there was only so much you could do about it because you had to be concerned about your client, whether it was on the civil side or the criminal side.
I don't think I could add much more to that, and really don't want to be repetitive. When I started with Kurtz at 78, when he was doing this revolutionary good lawyer thing, there were 3 women, and it was me and a lady who had been in the prosecutor's office. Her name is Mary Houseman. She had been a prosecutor and came to the defense side, and she stayed less than a year, about a year, and went back to the prosecutor's office, and another lady. And Kurtz, as a leader, really had no problems hiring women. He really didn't. We tried cases, we represented clients, and it was a little rougher than it was when Jimmie Lynn came along, because he, as a leader, also was finding his way. And he didn't think there was anything that we couldn't do. Or I couldn't imagine anybody going to him saying, I can't do that. I went to him once and told him, I don't know if I can represent that gentleman. And he said, why? I said, I'm scared of him. Every time I look at him, his eyes didn't go straight, they kind of went. I said, I can't tell which eye's looking at me. He was accused of doing something really, really horrible. And I said, I'm just scared of him. You're not scared of anybody. I know you're not scared of I said, I'm not scared of you, but I'm scared of him. And that was maybe the only time in all the years of practice that I just said, I'm not going to do it because I'm afraid of something. But there just weren't many women around, and you got used to it. That's the way it was.
Well, let me say about Walter too. I mean, the good thing about Walter is he treated us just like he treated the men. I mean, there was no difference in the way he treated us. He pushed everybody. He didn't just push us, he pushed the men too. But that was good. He pushed us just like he pushed the men. He expected us to do the same thing. He didn't expect us to do more. He expected us to do the same thing. I mean, as far as mentors go, he's one of my all-time mentors.
The next question I have is, we've talked a little bit about what things look like back when you guys started practicing law, but I'll ask you first, Tina, and then we'll kind of go down the line. Do you think that female attorneys are still underrepresented in criminal law?
I can't speak for across the country. I'm going to imagine, yes, in rural areas, certainly. New York State is a county-based state, so we have 68 different counties. So I would imagine the answer to that is yes in the upstate, smaller counties. Not so in New York City, the large, I think at this point it's the majority. It's more of the majority of all of our offices. New York City is represented not only with Legal Aid Society, we're the citywide provider, but there's 5 other small nonprofits that do other counties. You've heard of some of them, Bronx Defenders, Brooklyn Defender Services. I would say we are probably answering that we would answer this the same, which is the majority of young women coming into our offices and want to practice. That's not to say that I think we have shattered the glass ceiling, because numbers isn't the issue in what we're hearing through the task force as we're going across the country listening. And we were just in Albuquerque. I could talk about that later, but I don't think it's the numbers as much as it is the treatment and implicit and explicit bias.
What do you think, Jimmie? Numbers?
Yes.
You agree in numbers women are underrepresented?
Yes.
I think you mentioned during our call, and I'll ask you to kind of expound on that a little bit. I think you said something along the lines of the numbers have increased, but the ratio has not.
Yeah, the number of female lawyers obviously has increased, but in terms of like panel members, defense lawyers, there's still just a very few female defense lawyers that we deal with in the federal system. I can't speak to the state system. Maybe there's somebody here who could, I don't know if Martina's still here or somebody else could speak to that. In my office, there are I don't know, 5 or 6 women, but still there are, I don't know how many lawyers we have now. It's Percentage-wise, I think we're down from where we were at one point, so I think we're underrepresented in my office. I think we're underrepresented across the country in the U.S. Attorney's offices. When you look at the management or supervisors, we're underrepresented there too. It's just a fact.
And I'll add to that, I never felt that way, even though the percentage was lower during my time with the Department of Justice in terms of female lawyers as compared to male. I feel it's much more pronounced now that I'm in private practice. Not so much at the entry level or associate level, but when you get to the partner level at law firms, and I think particularly in litigation in general, whether it's civil or criminal, that there's a big discrepancy between men and women. I don't think that's earth-shattering news to anyone in the room, but it has been very pronounced to me that I was much less aware of that gap as a government lawyer than now as an attorney in private practice.
Well, I need to correct something too. I'm not the criminal chief now. Not that that has anything to do necessarily with being underrepresented in the office, but I was the criminal chief. As most of you, I'm sure, know, U.S. attorneys make changes in management, and you get new U.S. attorneys in, and I'm no longer the criminal chief. Again, that has nothing to do with necessarily the representation of females in our management.
Mariah, what about you on the federal defender side? What does the ratio or the mix look like?
Well, as Jimmie Lynn said, there are fewer women proportionately. We have a panel, CJA panel, Criminal Justice Act panel. There are very few women in it. No one's, I can't say that those people who are allowing and putting people on the panel are turning it away. The question then is whether or not they're interested in doing this kind of work. In terms of my office, I've been the first assistant almost as long as the defender's been the defender. And we will hire women. We hire women, but still there are more men than women in our office as well.
And you have pretty low turnover in your office too.
We have to push them out. What am I saying? What am I saying? I've been there forever.
We were supposed to have one additional panelist, Kim Hottie, who would have added an interesting perspective because she is a practicing criminal defense lawyer. She may still handle some things civilly.
She's on the panel. In fact,
She is
She's
in
a
charge of
representative.
it.
she has a high-ranking position of a criminal justice CJA attorney, so she's a regional representative. And so
She's living the dream, I think, of being a solo criminal defense practitioner. And we were hopeful that she would be here, but she's actually waiting on a jury verdict from her most recent trial. But she's one of only a very few examples I can think of.
I'm sure she
criminal
would say
defense
that.
practitioners.
Yes, she is. And when well, there are a few. I mean, I don't. It's bad enough when you can name them.
Yeah, that's the problem.
That gives you the indicia of how bad it is. And she, in this national position that she takes on the CJA panel, could tell you that when she goes to these meetings, she probably is one of the very few women that are there. So yes.
Tina, you just hinted a moment ago about your thoughts on the glass ceiling. Does it still exist? Has it been shattered? And you're also as part of the task force, so can you give us your thoughts and kind of tell us what you've been hearing during your listening sessions? What does the glass, do we agree the glass ceiling still exists in some form today, but what does that look like now versus kind of what it looked like when Mariah and Jimmie started practicing?
So it's a lot more implicit is what we're hearing, right? We just came back, the task force went to Albuquerque and did an all-day listening session where we heard from public defenders, prosecutors, some judges, and private practitioners, and exactly what we talked a little bit about, sort of the inability to get work referred if you're a private practitioner from your male colleagues, you're not referred as much. Public defenders and prosecutors talking to us very openly and candidly about the implicit but also sometimes very explicit bias they get from court, sometimes clients, from judges. A lot of conversation about feeling there were some chiefs there, heads of offices or heads of units that feel very isolated in terms of not having mentors. And I will say that one of the things, certainly across the country, I could say is the very low number of women chiefs doing our work in public defense, and less so women of color. I think Martisa and Aisha Hui, who's now heading up Still She Rises in Tulsa. We're not seeing that in New York State. I will say my first walking into a chief defenders meeting in New York State and looking around the room, I was one of very few women. There were no people. There was one person of color, a man, but it was mostly white men running offices. And so when you look at that and you then think about, well, what is our responsibility to create affirming workplaces, our policies, you know, even things, and we have struggled with this even at Legal Aid Society, which is who selects the second seat of the trial? So in New York City, for instance, we have certification levels. So you don't walk into the front door and pick up a robbery in the first degree, right? You start slowly with misdemeanor cases, low-level cases. You then move to perhaps nonviolent felonies, where a prison sentence is not indefinite, and then you move on. Well, in order to do that, the requirements in New York State is that, in cities, particularly in 2 judicial departments, is you need trial experience. So who second seats and how you second seat, and that means who you're mentored by, well, we had to really undo that, because if you allowed staff to select their own second seats, what did you think was going to happen? Men would go with men. White people would go with white people, right? We had to undo that. Now, that was not explicit, that was very implicit, and we hear that sort of as we're talking to people, not just in New York State or New York City, but in Albuquerque, and we'll be in Spokane. And, you know, that's the stuff I think, that's the glass ceiling still. It's a little bit invisible, but it is still there. And then, of course, I'm reminded as I sit here and say, okay, I have a lot of people coming out of law school that are women in New York City, but are they staying in New York City in the metropolitan areas, or clearly not, right? Clearly not. And so looking at our recruitment and hiring and what we're doing in law schools in order to help expand the reach of the women and the lens women bring to our practice, I think, is the next wave.
It sounds like that right now the issue may not be with the number of women going into criminal justice, right? It sounds like the number of women are 50-50, if not more than 50-50 in law school classes. Many appear to be gravitating towards public service. That may not be the issue. I think the issue, it sounds like, is as women stay, or the longer they're in an office, do they have upward mobility and opportunities, and who's in charge of providing those opportunities, or how do they get those opportunities? So I'll turn it to Scarlett, and then Jimmie, Lynn, and Mariah. Tell me how that has worked in your experience. Have you run into a glass ceiling? Have you run into either explicit or implicit bias during your trajectory?
I agree with Tina. I feel it much more implicitly than explicitly, and I think, as I've already alluded to, I was much less aware of it as a federal prosecutor. I never felt like my gender played into the kinds of cases I was prosecuting, the specific case assignments, the collateral duties I was asked to take on. I didn't feel like there was any opportunity that was not open to me as an AUSA because I'm a woman. I don't feel that way about private practice either, but because I think to a much greater degree than in the public sector, things do happen on golf courses or at the bar or late night dinners, and you've got to be that person that comes to mind first. And so I think that is much more challenging. And sometimes it's right where you went to college that results in a referral. But it's often who is your buddy, who were you last on the golf course with. So I feel like that's where it is a challenge as a female private practitioner.
And there's a little bit of that. I'm glad Scarlett didn't feel it in our office. And I don't think that there's explicit bias that goes on, but it is a bit of the buddy system that goes on. And when I was criminal chief, I did sometimes insert myself more than people wanted me to in making some decisions about who should be second chairing what cases, because I wanted to have some, I kept calling it cross-pollination. I wanted to get, I wanted to have a different mix. I wanted to have some certain newer AUSAs who maybe didn't have a particular kind of experience, or maybe somebody of color who I wanted them to work with somebody else, or maybe a female. I wanted them to work with a male. I was trying to get a different mix there, because my theory was that if people work together, generally speaking, especially knowing that we have good people in my office, generally speaking, those people would develop a good relationship, and that would then start to blossom and would continue on. So my theory was that would be a good thing for the office. It would be a good thing for the cases, it would be a good thing for the office, it would be a good thing for the people, and that ultimately this would result in some more of people working together with different people, not just the same people over and over again. It would also give a lot of different people different opportunities that maybe they hadn't had before too. Don't see quite as much of that going on right now as I would like to see, but it's not my responsibility, so I've learned to say it's not my problem.
Mariah, what do you think?
Well, let's see if I can understand the question as it relates to what my office. We have quite a few women lawyers. We have quite a few black lawyers. And when I started, when we were talking the other day, I was asked, was I treated differently because I was a woman? I didn't know why I was, if I thought I was being treated differently, I didn't know if it was because I was a woman, because I'm a black person, or because I'm a black woman. And in our office, in terms of people trying cases together, it really depends on your caseload. We get along so well, and we just talk so openly about each other and about what's going on. It depends on who worked well on this case with me, who has the time to give to this case. Unless I'm blind to it, I don't see that we make a distinction like that in our small office. That's just, but in a bigger setting, I don't know. We're friends for the most part. Like I said, most of us have been there forever. And so you know other people's strengths or weaknesses. Some people get better. I get along pretty good with most clients. So often they'll say, Mariah, we go talk to my client. I'll talk to your client. No, but
that means you'll talk some sense into
Unless they have crazy eyes.
unless they have crazy eyes and they burn up somebody. But it just depends on your strength in terms of the trial, your availability. I don't want to act like I work in a utopia, because more than anything, we're short on everything. We don't have enough time, we don't have enough people, and so we pretty much team up together and do what we can.
Let me try to ask the question and be a little bit more specific too. Do you think that there are challenges specific to criminal law in particular that may not discourage women from entering into criminal justice work, but become more clear after they've practiced criminal law for a while, that then causes them to self-select out of the practice, or decide that they want to kind of take a step back or not pursue upward mobility in the same way that they maybe thought they would when they started?
We heard a few women speak about when they had children, sort of look, and this is whether it's trial practice or just sort of specific to criminal trials, but certainly when you are a trial attorney and you have young children, things happen, and hearing a thing like, I was in the middle of a hearing and my kid was sick. And what's really interesting there is the response of the system, right, to that, because what we also heard was, I was married, but my husband couldn't take off, right? Whose job was more important there? Hearing a lot about, and this has, I think, a lot to do with us thinking about, and we're going to look at data in our task force about the, when you make a decision, if you want to go be work someplace else as a woman, and you get a job offer, or you want to move, but your husband is someplace, will he move for you versus the other way around? And so people leave their jobs, and we heard people leave their jobs because my husband, and I have gotten a fair amount of attrition where, because it's so expensive in New York, you leave for childcare, or my husband is going to, and I'm going with him. The policies about childcare. Now this again goes not specific to criminal practice, but certainly the policies we have. Well, yeah, they're set to be fair, right? So when you look at parental leave, you know, both sides of the equation now get 12 weeks. It's sort of gender neutral, right? Legal. However, as applied, it is really different. And you almost need to tip the scale toward making it actually sort of different for women because the need is different. The fact that there are things that women have to do with young children. And we heard a lot of that. We heard a lot about sort of the gender neutrality of things. We get it. But it isn't really like that in practice. And how do you undo that to make it really more affirming for women so people stay?
And I think specific to criminal justice, everyone talked about getting bitten by the bug or getting the virus, and that's very true, but it's also very hard work. It's physically, emotionally, and mentally demanding and exhausting when you're in a trial. And this is just a specific example, but I had done almost everything you can do in the U.S. Attorney's Office in terms of the types of cases, but I had a big RICO gang trial and was at Home Depot 20 miles down the road here on a Sunday afternoon and got a call from the case agent letting me know that they had just found out the gang had put a hit out on me. I was by myself, single at the time, and so that was a 4-week trial. But it was shortly after that I moved out of violent crime into white collar. There were things going on in my personal life too that just made it the right time to transition out of that kind of work. But it took a personal toll. I mean, you don't want to feel like your life is in jeopardy because of the work you're doing. Again, I think that's a very specific example and probably doesn't speak to the broader issue of why people, women specifically, choose to leave the practice of criminal law, but it certainly had an impact on my life and career path.
I'm not sure, I mean, I don't know what folks in private practice make, but my guess is that it's probably not as financially rewarding to do criminal defense as it is to be in civil private practice in a large firm.
I would say you're probably right about that.
I would think so. That's my guess. That's why Scarlett didn't come back to our office.
I'll say one other thing. I've practiced for a long, long time, and I've represented many, many people, but occasionally you run across a man who doesn't want to hear from a woman. A client. I've had one very recently. And I kind of put that aside because I was representing this person. And whenever I would meet with him, I could have said, well, if you're not going to listen to me, I'll just let you go down the river. But no, I would have my investigator there. It was a male investigator who was assigned to the case, and no matter what I said, whatever I said, he would repeat. And it was as if this gentleman was listening to him and not to me. And we were able to move forward. I had to put behind any ego I may have had. I really didn't have any ego about it, to be honest. I was just trying to get the job done. I was trying to represent the person. But it's a little difficult when you realize that. It's harder when the problem is racial, because they may say some things that they may say some things. I don't want to say how I want to react then, but it's harder. So you have to deal with it and adjust, or decide what are you going to do that's not going to hurt the client. How are you going to react to the situation where you can still be the best lawyer for that person, and if you can't, you need to recognize it. So whatever for that sort.
And have you ever had a situation where you had to just say, I need to get off because?
I've done enough cases because of things clients have said.
What about the issue of flexibility? Do you think that there's, and we can open it up for a discussion too, because I want to hear from everybody in the room, but having been a prosecutor working at a DA's office in court almost every single day for almost 5 years, and being in the trial queue constantly, you know, you finish a trial, you put that case aside, your boss says great job and hands you another stack of cases that just came off the grand jury that you have to go through and make offers on and evaluate, and you get the next 5 or 10 cases, because you're always getting 5 or 10 cases ready for trial at the same time. It's never just the one unless it's a big case. And so you do that grind for a number of years. And then to add to that, at the time I was single and I really didn't have a life because I was living in a small town in Alabama and I like to work. So, but you know, when you add to that mix the challenge of being a mother and having small children and being married, then all of a sudden you have to start making some decisions and, you know, deciding where your value propositions are and the sacrifices that you're willing to make and what you're willing to do. So is that something that is coming up during these listening sessions? Is the practice of criminal law less flexible in some respects than maybe other aspects of the legal practice because of the demand and the requirements of being in court?
Yes, I mean, wholeheartedly on both sides. We heard it from prosecutors and we heard it from defense attorneys. And Linda, you have your hand up.
I raised my hand because I've been a prosecutor in both Minnesota and Hennepin County and in Texas, in the county just north of Dallas. And I did that from 79 to 87, and then 88 to 95. So during that time, I had my children, and in both jobs, I worked out a situation with my boss, an ability to work a much more flexible schedule. When after I had my daughter in 1982, I was on a child sex abuse team, and I had that job for about 2 years. I was pregnant with my son during that time, and I worked week on, week off. And what that meant is that on Monday, I'd come in, start a trial, finish a trial by Friday, leave, go home for 10 days. Now you all know that I wasn't just not working, that I was getting ready for cases, and I was constantly doing what I needed to do to kind of keep the balls in the air. But it just meant so much to have that flexibility and still be able to be a trial lawyer. And then when I went to Texas, I was the grand jury attorney, and I also was able to, for a couple of years, work out a flexible arrangement where, again, I shared a job. And so we were, my partner and I were responsible to keep each other's caseloads moving forward when we weren't there. And what bothers me is that, you know, as we're in 2019, is that I don't hear those arrangements anymore. Mm-hmm. When I was in Hennepin County, many women were doing the same thing and sharing their job and had a work like I was. And it wasn't something that I saw as unusual in Texas either, even though that office hadn't done it before. But I don't see those kinds of opportunities being given to women. So when I was still in Texas, but a juvenile court magistrate, I saw a lot of my peers leaving the DA's office because they could go on the appointment list, make money, and have a more flexible schedule with their kids. There weren't just enough options. There aren't enough options today.
Let's go back here and then we'll go over here.
I had my kids when I was at the federal government. And the thing that shocked me is there's no maternity leave. And so I had my kids 14 months apart. And so 6 months and I find out, we're having another baby and I had to come off maternity leave, work, go back on maternity leave. But you're taking all of your time. I'm sorry. You're taking all of your annual leave and all of your sick leave, and then they'll give you unpaid leave. But when you come back, and as we all know, your child gets sick, and now you're dealing with the situation like Tina was saying, who stays home? My husband was a federal agent, he's a Secret Service agent, so he was traveling all over the place, and so it was me. And I thankfully had a supervisor in DC who was incredibly flexible. And then when I came to Atlanta, who was incredibly flexible. But I don't know how women do it without that. And that affects then women in management because, if you're not, it used to be that the career people were the people that went up to management. But if you're trying to be a working mom and you have no maternity leave and you have to make that decision, well, then I can't be a trial attorney, which I love, and be a mom. I'm going to choose being a mom. Then it's going to wipe out, that pool to rise to management.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have 3 kids. They're all 26 months apart. They're older. My oldest is just turned 10, and then an almost 8-year-old and a 5.5-year-old. I'm here in Nashville. But when I left law school, I went to the federal government. I was a contracts attorney. I was not in litigation at all. I was for the Corps of Engineers, so I was in-house counsel basically. But yes, it's so true. You had to build up your maternity leave. So I was working, and I was the primary caregiver, because even if I'm the president of the United States, the parenting plan would be 70-30, 100%. There's no doubt in my mind. So that's what I tell everyone. My husband travels all the time to Asia and all over the world. He's never home. And even when he is home, he comes home at like 8 o'clock at night. So morning, evenings, that's my job. Always has been. And so when kids got sick, it was on me because I made less money than he did, and I still do. I'm a private attorney now in the criminal defense bar, and I started that practice in January of 2017 and through an appointment. And I find that it is incredibly difficult to have your solo practice, and I'm an associate with a firm, a small firm here in town, but I have to get my caseload up. It's everything I make is because of me. And the ability to go to the jail. I go to jails on Sunday morning because that's the only time I have, because I can't get out of court, go to a jail, and still pick up my kids at 5 o'clock. It's not going to happen. It's so difficult. And I haven't had the experience of going to trial yet, but I've had the experience of prepping for a trial, and it was a hot mess. It took me an entire weekend. I'm also an Orthodox Jew, so let's count Saturday out. I don't do anything on Saturday. So I would say being a mom is beyond hard in this profession. But to the other point of why we don't take full maternity leaves and you don't see job sharing, I think it's scary to put yourself as a younger person in the field. It was when I came to the Corps of Engineers, I already had one kid. I had her my last semester of law school, and I got pregnant shortly after coming to the Corps with my second. But I didn't want to show any weakness, and I had either 40 hours a week, and I had a woman boss, and she was not willing to let me work at home. And if I wanted to rise up in the management structure, I couldn't have taken a job share, because that would have demoted me in her mind. And I think that is a fear that a lot of women have, is that you have to stay on task with these men. So the idea of taking a job share just isn't there if you want to rise through the ranks. But that's been my experience. I know it's probably a harsh one, but that's where it is.
I think that's a valid point, is that it's not just the men keeping the women down. Sometimes it's the women keeping other women down and being inflexible and not being willing to, or open to alternate work arrangements. I think that's fantastic, but and maybe I'll, Mariah and Jimmie, Lynn and Scarlett can speak to this, or Tina, is it more difficult to kind of turn the ship government-wise, right, to get a sort of flexible arrangement? Because if you're thinking about somebody in public service, if you have somebody who's working from home, there's all kinds of perceptions about, are you really working? What are you doing? We have an obligation to at least have the appearance that your taxpayers' dollars are being well used. And so is that part of the problem? One, that it's government, and two, that there's this perception issue with allowing people and employees to have a certain level of flexibility.
I'll let Jimmie Lynn go first.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think it is much more difficult to make changes at the government level. And I was actually talking to Jimmie Lynn and former colleagues from the U.S. Attorney's Office this morning about rush hour traffic in Nashville. It's, for those of you who are local, it's not fun, and I know it's not fun in DC or other parts of the country. The government is very rigid about, you have to be there by this time and must stay until this time, and that's one of the huge benefits, I think, of being in private practice, is that no one cares. No one's looking to see at what time I get to my office, and if I need to do an 8:30 call from home and then come in after rush hour, then that's fine. But that was not available to me as a government lawyer.
There is less flexibility, I think, in government. And part of it, I think, is due to the need to have a perception that people are there, responsible, doing their job, that sort of thing. It's also, I think it's important to remember that, at least in our office, on the criminal side, many of us are in court all the time. Maybe on the white collar side, the folks don't have to go quite as frequently as we do, but, or on the, we call them the blue collar side, the people who are doing the violent crime cases and drug cases, I can need to go see a judge or go to court 3 to 4 times a day. So I can't do that if I work at home. Now, if I need to work on a brief, I probably do need to be at home because I can't get it done in the office because I'm going to be interrupted. I can't get anything done. But I need to meet with agents. There are things, the way that I conduct my business, what I do, and what people who do similar tasks to what I do, we need to be there in the office to get it done, unfortunately. Do I have to be there, at 8 o'clock or 8:30 every morning? No, not unless I have to be in court. But the rules say I have to be there.
Well, my situation is somewhat different. In the last few years, I've had a number of surgeries. And when I got to the point that I could work, but I really couldn't come to the office, or I still was going through treatment or whatever, they brought me boxes of material for me to work on the cases that I thought I could work on. Cases that required a lot of contact with the clients, I was not able to do. But I had many other kind of cases. And also, my boss does not require to come in at a certain time or leave at a certain time.
That's why nobody leaves your office.
Nobody leaves. He doesn't require that I'm there as long as I get what I have to get done. And unfortunately for us, none of the clients, I had a lot of clients who are in custody, but none of them are in custody in this city. They're 2.5 hours away, everybody, or longer, or farther rather. And so we're out of the office a lot doing those kinds of things, and we often have to do that on the weekend or at night. So he's not really monitoring. Mariah's not here at 8 o'clock. Mariah's never there at 8 o'clock unless there's an 8 o'clock meeting in court, because I'm going to try to persuade him out of the 8 o'clock meeting. But so he's not really on us on that, but we really do have to maintain, we have to do what we have to do.
Even we have part-time, we have a certain number of part-time positions, and I will say overwhelmingly they are women who have children. But look, the implication of that is part-time is really not part-time, right? You just said it, right? You are working from home. You are prepping your cases. You are reading your email. You may physically be not in the office. You are working as a public defender all the time. And it's the same. We're in court a lot, so you can't really do the work from home because we get a call. You have a client who warranted. Yesterday, a client comes back voluntarily. You're over there with your client. We do vertical representation in our office, and so that is your client, and that's my responsibility. And so particularly because not a lot of people who are at a point where they're raising families or having families, the cost of living is such in New York City that you live far away. You live in a suburb. So that's an hour sometimes commute, and that you can't. So it's almost impossible. And I will say, even when somebody's part-time, I know they're working full-time. Their caseload is not part-time, and because of the way it works out, they're paying partial health care. Right? And so there's a cost to that. And that's government, right? When you're in the government, that's sort of what happens. And so we really have to look at structures and pay scales and policies in a whole new way. Some of this we won't be able to change, right? We're not going to be able to change the structure of the courts.
Let me just say one last thing. The government does encourage offices to work out flexible work schedules and do that. It just doesn't do it very often. We did have a situation where Lisa worked part-time. She had a job share with another AUSA in the office when she was doing some civil work, but she didn't work just part-time. She worked more than half-time. So she's she's a good example of how you say you're working part-time, but we all know you're working more than part-time. But that was the only time, and I think the office, I don't know if they consider doing that again or not, but I think it can work on the civil side, but it's very difficult. I think it's difficult for the people who are trying to manage it because they still have case responsibilities that continue on, even if it's not during the time that they're there for the tour.
Yes, I'd like to talk about the fact that we shouldn't focus only on structures, because what I've seen is there are other forces for change, generational, and also men as allies. I recently changed law firms, and at the law firm I was previously at, there was a woman who, was remarkable. She made it when it was really hard. She must be in her late 70s. But she was really hard on the young women. I didn't get into I wasn't in her line of sight, but the young women who had families were, and she had 2 kids of her own, but her view was, nobody gave me a break, nobody helped me up, nobody had any support for me, so do it on your own. But the opposing force to that is in the millennial men, I saw something, which was that they were, in fact, taking parental leave. They would send emails during the day that didn't say, I'm leaving to go to a meeting, but said, I'm leaving because my kid is sick and I have to pick him up. I saw a lot of emails flying around from millennial men saying, I'll be coming in late because there's an event at my kid's school. And I think that this generational change with the millennials is going to be an important force that we should harness, that we should align ourselves with. One way that I made it through on an individual level, and we've all got our own stories, our own anecdotes, and our own struggles. I think I struggled less because maybe I married the only man in the world who's really 50-50 with childcare, and his career is as important as mine, and he sees it that way. There's a big event that's important to our daughter tomorrow night. There was never any question that he would say, well, gee, aren't you going to go on Thursday night? He jumped in, and he jumped in with a smile. He's like, of course I'm going to take her. It really is 50-50. I may know we have to schedule a doctor appointment for the physicals for camp and school, but 75-80% of the time, he takes the kid to the doctor appointment. So he travels a lot, I travel a lot. It's a real teamwork thing, and I know there aren't enough of those partners out there, but they do exist. And what Ruth Bader Ginsburg said is right. One of the best career choices you can make is who you decide to partner with. I've been a beneficiary of that, but that's just anecdotal, and I think systemically we have to look at what's going on with millennial men and use their force and their presence to advance protections for all professionals who want to balance work and family and have it not fall just on our shoulders.
Yeah, I think that, do we have anybody else? I know we're kind of, we're right at 12:16. April's giving me the eye. And I don't want to hold anybody up for lunch. Thank you guys for joining us for our breakout session. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll stick around up here if you have any questions or want to talk further about this. Thank you.